The highway stretching beyond the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia lay shrouded in the stillness of a damp night, its slick asphalt glistening under the occasional sweep of headlights from passing cars. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows across the deserted road, their feeble glow barely piercing the darkness. It was just shy of 11 p.m., the kind of hour when the world seemed to slow, when most people craved the sanctuary of home after the day's relentless demands. Major Alicia Harper sat behind the wheel of her modest sedan, her fingers tapping lightly against the steering column in rhythm with the soulful strains of an old jazz tune spilling from the speakers. She wasn't in her military uniform tonight, no crisp fatigues or insignia to mark her rank, just a plain gray sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back into a tight, practical bun. To any passerby, she was just another weary traveler, unremarkable and anonymous. She'd been driving for nearly 2 hours, the hum of the road and the music lulling her into a state of quiet calm, when a sudden flash of red and blue lights erupted in her rearview mirror, slicing through the tranquility like a jagged blade. Her stomach tightened, not from fear, for her years in the military had forged nerves of steel, but from a bone-deep weariness she knew all too well. With a practiced flick, she activated her turn signal, eased into the right lane, and guided her car onto the shoulder, parking with precision before resting her hands visibly on the wheel, a reflex honed by countless drills. A white patrol car rolled to a stop behind her, its lights painting the night in stark, pulsing hues. The officer stepped out with a deliberate slowness, his heavy boots scuffing against the asphalt as if to announce his presence. One hand rested casually on his belt, near the holstered gun, while the other gripped a flashlight that snapped on as he approached her window. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across her face, and in that fleeting moment, the nameplate on his chest caught the light, Malone. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat and mechanical, devoid of greeting or courtesy, a command issued with the expectation of instant obedience. Alicia met his gaze in the rearview mirror, her brown eyes steady and unflinching, then reached slowly into the glove compartment, retrieving her documents with the calm precision of someone who'd faced far greater threats than this. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her tone even, betraying no hint of unease. Malone didn't respond immediately. He took the papers from her hand, holding them just beyond her reach as he cast a cursory glance over her car, his flashlight darting from bumper to bumper. "Tail lights out," he said at last, his words clipped and final. Alicia frowned, her brow creasing slightly. "That can't be right," she replied, her voice firm but measured. She knew her car had been serviced just 3 weeks prior, the tail lights checked and confirmed functional by a meticulous mechanic at the base. Malone turned to face her directly, his eyes narrowing as if her response had struck a nerve. "You arguing with me?" he asked, his tone sharpening with a hint of menace. A tense silence settled between them, the air crackling with unspoken challenge, like a taut wire stretched to its limit, waiting for one side to snap. For Alicia, this moment was achingly familiar. Over her decade in the military, she'd navigated power struggles more times than she could count, from barked orders in dusty training camps to high-stakes standoffs on foreign soil, where defiance could mean death. She knew her rights under the law, understood the delicate balance of asserting them without tipping the scales toward chaos. "I'm just saying the lights were checked a few weeks ago," she said, her voice steady, devoid of hostility but laced with quiet conviction. Malone, however, seemed uninterested in reason. "Step out of the car," he snapped, cutting her off as if her words were meaningless noise. Alicia exhaled slowly, a controlled breath to quell the spark of frustration flickering within her. She unlatched the door and stepped onto the pavement, the cool night air biting through her sweater, sharper than she'd expected. She stood tall, her posture relaxed yet vigilant, not because she sought a fight, but because she'd been trained never to let her guard drop. Malone took a step back, his eyes raking over her from head to toe, assessing her with a predatory glint, as if calculating how far he could push this unassuming woman. "Turn around, hands on the car," he ordered, his voice hardening into a steel edge. Alicia paused, her gaze locking onto his, unwavering. "For what reason?" she asked, her question simple but pointed, not a challenge but a demand for clarity. Malone closed the gap between them, the faint smirk on his lips vanishing. "You resisting?" he growled, his hand hovering near his belt. Alicia held her ground, her stance unshaken. "No, I'm asking a question," she said, her voice low and resolute, a quiet declaration that she wouldn't be intimidated. Her response seemed to ignite a fuse in Malone. He yanked the radio from his shoulder, barking into it with a sharp edge, "Got a non-compliant driver here." Then, louder, he barked, "Turn around." Alicia's pulse quickened, a subtle thrum beneath her calm exterior, but her face remained a mask of composure. She stared into his eyes, her voice dropping to a firm, deliberate cadence. "Officer, I need you to understand something. I know exactly what my rights are, and I know what you can't do." Her words landed like a quiet thunderclap, cutting through Malone's bravado. His jaw tightened, a flash of anger mingled with unease flickering in his eyes. "You're under arrest," he spat, lunging for the handcuffs on his belt. Alicia stepped back just enough to evade his initial grab, her movements fluid and precise. "Under arrest for what?" she asked, her tone still calm but now edged with a steely resolve. Malone didn't bother with an answer. He seized her wrist with a rough jerk, snapping the cuffs on with unnecessary force, the metal biting into her skin as he twisted her arms behind her back. "Obstructing an officer," he declared, his voice dripping with triumph as he shoved her toward the patrol car. Alicia exhaled sharply through her nose, recognizing the power play for what it was. Her military training surged to the forefront, heartbeat steady, breathing even, mind razor-sharp. She weighed her options in an instant: comply now and fight this battle later, or resist and risk a dangerous escalation. She'd seen the news, knew the stories of those who didn't make it out of encounters like this. With a deliberate turn, she placed her hands on the car's roof, letting Malone cuff her and push her into the back seat. As he slammed the door shut, she murmured under her breath, "You don't know what you're doing." Malone chuckled, striding to the driver's side. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing," he shot back, his voice thick with arrogance. But he didn't, not even remotely. The patrol car's hard plastic seat pressed unforgivingly into Alicia's back, the cuffs digging into her wrists with a dull, persistent ache. She kept her breathing measured, her eyes fixed ahead through the partition as Malone slid into the driver's seat, whistling a jaunty tune that grated against the tension of the moment. The car jolted forward, its red and blue lights casting an eerie glow across the highway as it merged back into the sparse traffic. "Most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out," Malone said after a stretch of silence, his tone casual but laced with mockery. Alicia responded with a faint exhale, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop," she said, her words calm but pointed, a subtle rebuke that hung between them. Malone laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed in the confined space. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody," he said, glancing at her through the rearview mirror with a sneer. Alicia met his gaze through the glass, her eyes unflinching. "I don't think, I know," she replied, her voice low and weighted with an unshakable certainty. Her words made Malone falter, his knuckles widening as they gripped the steering wheel, but he quickly masked his irritation with a forced grin. "Military, huh?" he asked, his tone shifting to a mocking curiosity. Alicia didn't answer, her silence a wall he couldn't breach. "Yeah, I figured," he continued, talking more to himself than to her. "Thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" "Shame." He shrugged, feigning indifference, but the tightness in his shoulders betrayed him. Her refusal to engage gnawed at him, a splinter under his skin he couldn't ignore. The police station emerged from the darkness ahead, a squat, gray brick building squatting off the main road, its parking lot nearly empty under the sodium glow of a single street lamp. Malone pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned to peer at her through the partition. "Gotta say, I do love when they make it easy," he murmured, his lips curling into a smug smile before he stepped out, slamming the door behind him. Moments later, he yanked her door open, gesturing for her to get out. Alicia twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped onto the pavement, the cuffs cutting deeper into her skin, a deliberate cruelty she noted silently. She kept her head high as he led her inside, past a bored desk sergeant who barely glanced up from his paperwork, and into the processing area. The air reeked of stale coffee and sweat, a metal bench lining one wall, a steel door to the cells looming beyond it. Malone guided her through the routine with practiced efficiency, fingerprints pressed onto a scanner, a mugshot snapped under harsh fluorescent lights. The officers at the desk moved like automatons, their indifference a stark contrast to Malone's barely concealed glee. He uncuffed her just long enough to shove her into a holding cell, then locked the door with a clang that reverberated through the small space. "Enjoy your stay, smartass," he sneered, tapping the bars with a mocking lightness before turning on his heel and walking away. Alicia sank onto the cold metal bench, the chill seeping through her jeans as she settled in. Her breathing remained slow and steady, her gaze fixed on the flickering light above. She'd spent nights in worse conditions, cramped bunks in desert outposts, sleepless vigils in hostile territories. This was nothing by comparison. But beneath her calm exterior, a quiet anger simmered, fueled not by the discomfort but by the injustice of it all. Through the bars, she heard the faint murmur of voices from the front desk, the shuffle of papers, the clink of a coffee mug against wood. Then, the unmistakable thud of Malone's heavy footsteps returned, his arrogant stride echoing down the hall. He appeared before her cell, arms crossed over his chest, that same smirk plastered across his face. "Comfy?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Alicia allowed a faint smile to curve her lips, subtle but deliberate, a weapon in its own right. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. Malone's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features, but he quickly covered it with a scoff. "No one's coming for you tonight, lady," he said, shrugging as if her fate were sealed. "Guess you'll have some time to think about that attitude." He leaned closer to the bars, lowering his voice. "See, people like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence gets you out of trouble. Not this time." Alicia watched him, unmoved, her silence louder than any retort. She let him ramble, let him dig his own grave with every word, because she knew something he didn't: the tide was about to turn. As if on cue, another officer approached from the hallway, a younger man, barely out of his 20s, dressed in a crisp uniform, clutching a clipboard with a nervous grip. Officer Malone," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation, "we got a call. I think you need to see this." Malone barely glanced at him, irritation flashing across his face. "What?" he snapped, but the younger officer persisted, shifting uneasily. "It's about her. You need to come look." Malone frowned, casting one last glare at Alicia before following the officer out of sight. She sat back, listening as their hushed voices drifted back to her, snippets of a lawyer's name, a call from someone high up, questions about why she was being held. Malone's tone grew sharper, more defensive, while the younger officer stammered in response. When Malone returned, his footsteps were heavier, his jaw tight, his smirk erased. He stopped before her cell, hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded, his voice low and accusing. Alicia leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees, her gaze unflinching. "I didn't do anything," she said, tilting her head with a faint, knowing smile. "But people talk. And some of us have friends in very high places." Malone's face darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes as realization began to creep in. He wasn't in control anymore, he just didn't know how badly he'd miscalculated. He turned abruptly, muttering something under his breath, and stormed off down the hall. Alicia exhaled, settling back against the wall. It wouldn't be long now. Malone had no idea who he'd tangled with, and when the truth came crashing down, he'd regret every choice that had led him here. Morning light streamed through the narrow windows of the Atlanta courthouse, casting golden streaks across the polished wooden floors. The air inside was crisp, carrying a chill that settled into the bones of anyone who lingered too long. Alicia stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, scanning the room with the precision of a soldier assessing a battlefield. She was no longer in cuffs, no longer confined to a cell, just dressed in a tailored navy blazer and a simple blouse, her presence commanding without effort. Beside her, her attorney, Evelyn Carter, flipped through a stack of papers with methodical efficiency, her sharp features set in a mask of focus. Evelyn was a woman of few words, her movements precise and purposeful, and Alicia appreciated that. No nonsense, no wasted time. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Officer Malone strode in, still carrying himself with an air of authority, shoulders squared, chin lifted, but there was a stiffness in his step now, a subtle crack in his armor. His eyes darted briefly to Alicia, then away, a flicker of unease betraying his bravado. She caught it, filing it away silently. The judge entered moments later, a gray-haired man with a weary expression, his robes rustling as he settled behind the bench. Judge Marcus Ellison adjusted his glasses, peering over the case files with a sigh. "All right," he said, his voice gravelly from years of presiding over disputes, "let's get to it." The prosecutor, a wiry man with neatly combed hair and a crisp suit, stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Major Alicia Harper, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new evidence suggests a pattern of misconduct by the arresting officer, Daniel Malone." A murmur rippled through the sparse crowd, court staff, a few reporters, and curious onlookers drawn by whispers of the case. Malone shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the table. Judge Ellison peered at him over his glasses. "Officer Malone, care to explain?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. Malone leaned forward, clearing his throat with a forced confidence. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. She refused to comply with lawful orders." The prosecutor cut in smoothly, raising a document from his stack. "Uncooperative," he said, arching an eyebrow. "Major Harper's record shows a distinguished military career, West Point graduate, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that, despite all this, she posed such a threat over a supposed broken tail light that you had to arrest her?" Malone opened his mouth, then shut it, his words faltering under the weight of the prosecutor's scrutiny. The silence stretched, heavy and damning. The prosecutor pressed on, flipping through his papers with a calm authority. Additionally, an internal review of Officer Malone's arrest history reveals a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district, over 60% in the past 3 years, far exceeding the demographic makeup of the area. The murmurs in the room grew louder, a low buzz of shock and indignation. Malone's face flushed, his hands clenching into fists. Judge Ellison set his file down with a sigh, his expression darkening. "Officer Malone, I don't like what I'm hearing," he said, his voice carrying a quiet steel. Malone sat back, crossing his arms defensively. "She resisted," he insisted, his tone growing sharper. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "The body cam footage says otherwise," he replied, nodding toward the bailiff. Another ripple of noise moved through the room as a screen descended at the front of the courtroom. Alicia didn't turn to watch, she'd lived it, felt every second of that night etched into her memory. The video played, filling the silence with Malone's barked orders, her calm responses, the unnecessary escalation, the smug way he'd tightened the cuffs until they bit into her skin. When it ended, the room was still, the weight of the evidence pressing down like a physical force. Judge Ellison leaned forward, steepling his fingers, his eyes boring into Malone. "Officer Malone, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement. Do you have anything to say?" Malone opened his mouth, but the judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "The charges against Major Harper are hereby dismissed," he declared, his gavel striking the bench with a sharp, final crack. "And I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Officer Malone's conduct." The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. Malone's face flushed a deep red, his fists trembling at his sides, while Alicia exhaled slowly, her composure unbroken. She'd never doubted this outcome, not for a moment. As she gathered her things, she glanced at Malone one last time. Their eyes met, a silent exchange heavy with meaning. No words were needed. This time, it wasn't her reputation on the line, it was his. Malone stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished halls. He could feel the eyes on him, other officers, court staff, reporters who'd caught wind of the case and swarmed like vultures. He wasn't used to this. He was accustomed to walking into a room and commanding respect, or fear, his badge a shield against accountability. But now, that shield was cracking, the power he'd wielded so carelessly slipping through his fingers. A sharp voice cut through the hallway noise. "Officer Malone." He turned, his stomach twisting as Chief Harold Grayson stood before him, arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. Grayson had been with the department for over 30 years, a towering figure whose word was law. "My office." "Now," the chief said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The door to the private office shut with a heavy thud, and Grayson's demeanor shifted from stoic to icy. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, tossing a thick file onto the desk. It landed with a dull smack, papers spilling slightly. Malone exhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice tight. "Your job?" Grayson scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "That's not what it looks like from here. The body cam footage, the arrest history, the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting," Malone cut in, his temper flaring. "What does that have to do with anything?" The chief leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Everything. This wasn't some random woman. This was a high-ranking army officer. You think this just goes away? Malone looked away, grinding his teeth. She was disrespectful. Grayson interrupted, his tone cutting like a whip. She questioned you. That's not a crime. Malone's silence stretched, thick with defiance he couldn't voice. Grayson sighed, rubbing his forehead. The DA's reviewing every case you've handled in the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling. Internal Affairs is taking over, and this department isn't syncing with you. Malone's stomach twisted, a cold sweat breaking across his brow. What does that mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grayson straightened, his gaze unrelenting. It means you're suspended, effective immediately. Pack your desk. And if I were you, I'd get a lawyer. The words hit Malone like a physical blow, his face burning with a mix of rage and disbelief. His career, his identity, was unraveling before his eyes, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't untouchable. Across town, Alicia sat in a quiet cafe, stirring a cup of coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The case had already hit the headlines: Major wrongfully arrested, officer suspended. She wasn't surprised. She'd known from the moment she stepped out of her car that night how this would end. She'd faced men like Malone before, entitled, arrogant, drunk on power they hadn't earned. Her phone buzzed, a message from Evelyn: Malone's out. Might face charges. Alicia took a slow sip, the warmth of the coffee grounding her. Good, she murmured, glancing out the window at the city moving on around her. This wasn't over, not for her, not for the countless others Malone had likely wronged. But today, she'd won. The afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain as Alicia stepped out of the cafe, the weight of the past 24 hours a distant echo rather than a burden. She walked with the same confidence she always had, head high, step steady, her phone buzzing again in her pocket. She sighed, recognizing the number, and answered. Captain, she greeted, her tone neutral. Major Harper, came the familiar voice of Captain James Rollins, her commanding officer. I assume you've seen the news? She nodded, though he couldn't see it. I have. A brief pause lingered before he continued. And how are you feeling? Alicia glanced at her reflection in a nearby storefront window. No cracks, no defeat, just the same resolute woman she'd always been. I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do, she said, her voice unwavering. Rollins chuckled softly, a rare break in his usual stern demeanor. That's what I thought you'd say. He paused, then added, the Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it. Alicia exhaled through her nose, her lips pressing into a thin line. Not sure I'm interested in being a headline, she said, her tone dry. You already are, Rollins countered, his voice firm but not unkind. And whether you like it or not, what happened to you reflects something bigger. She knew he was right. She'd always known. Malone wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom of a system that too often let men like him operate unchecked, preying on those without the rank, resources, or voice to fight back. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, she said, leaning against a streetlight as traffic hummed by. And it won't be the last. Rollins sighed on the other end. No, it won't. But it's the first time Malone's facing consequences, and that's because you didn't back down. His words settled over her, a quiet validation she didn't need but appreciated nonetheless. She hadn't backed down, not when Malone pulled her over, not when he tried to intimidate her, not when the cuffs bit into her wrists, not even when she sat in that cell, knowing the odds were stacked against her. She'd stood firm, and now the dominoes were falling. Rollins cleared his throat, breaking her reverie. "One last thing. You might get a call from the mayor's office." Alicia's eyebrows lifted, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Oh," she said, intrigued. "Seems they want to recognize you for handling this with professionalism and grace," he explained. She laughed softly, the irony not lost on her. "Now that's rich," she said, shaking her head. Rollins chuckled again. "You gonna accept it?" She thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I'll think about it." The call ended, and she tucked her phone away, her gaze drifting across the street. A mother walked hand in hand with her young son, his laughter ringing out, carefree and bright. Alicia watched them, a quiet resolve settling in her chest. She'd fought for herself, yes, but also for him, for every black child who deserved a world where badges weren't weapons in the hands of men like Malone. Days turned into weeks, and the fallout from the case rippled outward. Malone's suspension became a full investigation, internal affairs digging through years of complaints, traffic stops, arrests, patterns of bias that painted a damning picture. The media latched on, headlines screaming about police accountability, while protests flared in pockets of the city, demanding reform. Alicia watched it unfold from a distance, declining most interview requests but agreeing to a single sit-down with a local journalist who'd earned her respect. "This isn't about me," she told the reporter, her voice steady over the clink of coffee cups in the quiet diner. "It's about the people who don't have a camera, a lawyer, or a title to back them up. That's who we need to fight for." Back at the station, Malone sat in his apartment, the walls closing in as his phone buzzed with calls he didn't answer, lawyers, reporters, former colleagues distancing themselves. His badge lay on the table, a relic of a life he'd taken for granted, now tarnished beyond repair. The investigation uncovered more than he'd expected, witnesses coming forward, old cases reopened, a paper trail of abuses he'd thought buried. His lawyer warned him of potential criminal charges, but Malone barely heard the words, his mind replaying that night on the highway. He'd underestimated her, assumed she was just another target for his unchecked authority. Now, he was the one cornered, the hunter turned prey. For Alicia, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, back to the base, back to her duties, though the weight of her experience lingered. The mayor's office did call, offering a commendation she politely declined. "Give it to the community organizers," she told them. "They're the ones doing the real work." But the Department of Defense persisted, pulling her into a closed-door meeting with officials who saw her case as a catalyst for broader discussions on systemic issues. She spoke plainly, her words cutting through bureaucratic platitudes. "Power unchecked is power abused," she said, her voice echoing in the sterile conference room. "If you want change, hold the system accountable, not just the individuals." Months later, Malone faced trial, not just for her arrest, but for a string of violations spanning years. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation as evidence piled up against him. Alicia didn't attend. She didn't need to. She read the verdict in the news, guilty on multiple counts, a career ended, a message sent. It wasn't justice for everyone, not yet, but it was a start. She stood on her apartment balcony that night, the Atlanta skyline glittering below, and took a deep breath. The fight wasn't hers alone, never had been. But she'd played her part, and the echoes of her stand would ripple on, a quiet call to those who'd listen, speak up, stand firm, demand better. Because real change began with those who refused to stay silent.